God, blindness, and faith. It's very painful to be ignored or misunderstood by people who are supposed to love you. When people who are supposed to love you ignore you, it hurts. To some extent, we're prepared when strangers don't accept us. Man, we don't like it. We want to be accepted by people whether they know us or not. But we really aren't surprised when we're ignored or misunderstood by strangers. After all, they don't know us. But it hurts when people who know us treat us as if we don't matter, or as if we shouldn't matter. It hurts when people who know us refuse to understand who we are and how we tick. It hurts when people who should be able to see our potential overlook us as if we don't exist or as if we aren't worth their time and trouble. So the lessons from 1 Samuel 16 about David and from John 9 about an unnamed blind man strike home, really. These lessons reveal that God knows and understands what we experience when we're ignored and misunderstood. God knows and understands what we go through when people ignore us, and disregard us, and belittle us, and mischaracterize us. God knows what it means when the people around us act as if they're blind to our abilities and our worth. So let's see what we can learn based on what God knows concerning that blindness. Number one, God knows and wants us to know that face value judgments are often blind misjudgments. Face value judgments are often blind misjudgment. In the case of David, God had directed the prophet Samuel to travel to Bethlehem and select someone who would eventually succeed Saul as king of Israel. Think of Samuel as God's selection committee. God's doing a job search for a king. David is in Bethlehem. Samuel is a selection committee. Okay? Samuel is the head hunter. And God has sent Samuel on a search. Samuel knew his job was to identify the person God would select. Samuel knew where he was to look for that person. He even knew that he was to find that person among the sons of a guy named Jesse. So Samuel was more than a little bit surprised when he got to Bethlehem and called Jesse up and had Jesse bring his sons up, and none of the sons panned out. They looked fine to Samuel. That was the problem. They looked fine. They looked fine. David, Jesse's younger son, was overlooked. And notice, he was overlooked by his own daddy. David wasn't even invited to the party. To his own father, David was not worth having at the show. David wasn't a potential ruler. He was just the runt child. The disciples of Jesus didn't overlook the blind man we read about in John 9. They saw him. And then they quickly reason that his sightless condition must have resulted from some flaw in his morality or that of his parents. To their thinking, a person born blind from birth was afflicted either to punish his parents or to punish the man, or perhaps to punish both. Who sinned, they asked? Was it the man or his parents? The disciples didn't overlook the blind man. They just looked on him wrongly. They looked on him as if he deserved punishment because he was blind. To them, he was a moral reject. So we have David the runt on one hand and the blind man's the reject on the other. And notice something. God notices David. Jesus notices the blind man. The folks making the face judgments, the face value judgments, are in the misjudging business. Like Samuel and Jesse and the disciples of Jesus, notice these are religious people. Notice these are all church folk. You and I are often guilty of making surface judgments. We assign worth to people based on face value judgments, the same way that Samuel and Jesse and the disciples of Jesus did. Samuel shows how righteous people who are religious, Samuel was righteous and religious, can give people undeserved advantages based on face value judgment. Samuel was ready to anoint the first good-looking man he saw. If he was Jesse's son, that man got an undeserved benefit. He's Jesse's son, looks good, he's got to be qualified. Anybody know anything about folks getting undeserved advantages because of just how they look? Hello. Maybe they get undeserved advantages because they're the right gender. They get undeserved advantage because they're the right color. They get undeserved advantage because they come from the right side of town. They get undeserved advantage because they have the right kind of connections. The face value judgments give them undeserved benefits. And Jesse shows that people can misunderstand us even when we've been around them a long time. Jesse knew David was his son. I mean, Jesse knew where David was. Jesse knew that Samuel wanted to meet his sons. But Jesse didn't think David mattered for the meeting. We can make unreliable face value judgments, even about people we've known for years. We have heard the expression so many times, I didn't know she could do that, and I've known her for... I didn't know that he had that in him. Because of these face value judgments, we just don't get below the surface and find where people really are. And what this teaches us is that reliable judgments about people require more than face value analysis. And this is especially true when we're making moral judgments. The disciples of Jesus had no reason whatsoever to believe that that blind man was any more or less moral than anyone else, including themselves. However, they were ready to assign moral blame to that man and to his parents, or both of them, solely because the man was born blind. I look at people who assign moral blame to folks because they are not the right this, or they're not the right that. They assign, because they are this, they are less holy, less virtuous, less valuable. And Jesse, Samuel, and the disciples of Jesus show us that those snap judgments actually might be based on our biases and our prejudice rather than on truth. You see, there wasn't any truth in the notion that the firstborn son, the tradition, had the right to lead. That was the tradition, but that wasn't the truth. And oftentimes, what we do with our snap value judgments is we base our actions on the tradition, and because something fits within the snap value face appeal of our tradition, we move on it. And we're not doing it based on truth, we're just doing it because that's the tradition. That's just the way we have been wired to think. The truth about situations and people usually is like an iceberg. You know about an iceberg? The largest part of the iceberg is not the part you see above the waterline. Actually, only 1/8 of the iceberg. Only 1/8 of the iceberg is above the waterline. 7/8 of the berg is below the line. There's more to the iceberg that you don't see than there is to what you see. And if you are a sailor and you are steering based on the what you see, pretty soon you're going to run into the berg. Not because it wasn't there, but because you weren't looking below the waterline. The same thing is true about people. Truth concerning who people are and what their potential may be can't be determined by first appearances and first impressions. We should remember what God told Samuel at verse 7 of 1 Samuel 16. Don't look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Now notice now, God didn't reject him because of his good looking. God simply saying, just because he's good looking doesn't mean he's qualified. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. The heart of things, the heart of people is not found based on face value. It's found beneath the surface. Second lesson. God calls us to do more than look. God calls us to discern. God calls us to do more than look. God calls us to discern. Years ago, I had a wonderful time reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fantastic stories about Sherlock Holmes. I love Sherlock Holmes mysteries. In those stories, the great detective would occasionally remind his companion, Dr. Watson, about the need for discernment. Holmes didn't make up new clues to solve any mystery. He usually solved the crimes by making observations about the clues other people had seen but had missed. Other investigators had the same clues, but they had missed the solution because they only looked. They did not observe. Others looked. Sherlock Holmes observed. Discernment is the difference between looking and observing. It's the difference between being around someone and being with them. It's the difference between seeing and knowing. God calls us to do more than to look at the world or look at people and look at ourselves. God calls us to observe and to experience and to know. God calls us to exercise discernment. And David and the blind man are examples of what happens when we don't exercise discernment. David was overlooked as a son, and the blind man was misjudged as a moral failure by people who operated on the what it looks like level. The truth is that things aren't always what they seem. There is more to a situation than we realize. God revealed to Samuel and to Jesse, and to Jesus revealed to his disciples, that life is experienced on many levels. The way things appear is rarely all that there is. There's a whole lot more to life beneath the surface. There's a whole lot more to understand. So how do we learn discernment? That's the deal. Okay, preacher, there's a difference between looking and discerning, but how do we learn discernment? I'm glad you asked. Number one, discernment requires disciplined thinking and acting. Remember that seeing is more than looking. Understanding is more than knowing. To progress from looking to seeing and from knowing to observing and understanding requires disciplined thinking and acting. We have to learn to question and to wait for insight and to test whether our impressions are really square with what is true rather than just fit how we find it convenient to think or act. We are in the computer age, so you're familiar with pop-up icons on your screen. Don't they make you annoyed? Pop-up icons. Now, what do you have to do when a pop-up icon happens? You have to delete it, or you have to move beyond the icon. You don't click on the icon. You reject the icon to get to where you want to go. You escape from the icon in order to get to where you really want to go. If you click on the icon, you don't get what you want to see. But it takes discipline not to click on the icon. It takes discipline. You understand? Because there's a curiosity. What's behind this? And if we're not careful, we'll become icon clickers of pop-up icons. We'll become people who respond to the various pop-up icons around us. And we go through life reacting to pop-up icons. And I see some people, I see your eyes. You're thinking of some situation where, there was a pop-up icon, and I clicked on it, and that's that kind of stuff is getting kind of messed up. Discernment requires discipline in thinking and acting, because not only do you have to resist the pop-up icon when you think, you have to resist the pop-up icon when you act. Some people are pop-up icons. And they jump up in your way. And if you don't have some discipline, you will go off. And you have to learn to delete, get past, and say, no. Let me give you a scriptural text for this. Here's a scriptural text for your pop-up icons. Get thee behind me. Okay? Because in the wilderness, Jesus had pop-up icons. And what Jesus had to tell Satan was, get behind me. Excuse me, you are a pop-up icon. God has something else for me to do, and you keep popping up. Number two, I'm sorry, I digress. That wasn't on the text. Number two, move beyond the casual contacts to disciplined interactions. The casual glance at a blind man led the disciples to view him as a result of a moral deficiency by someone. But Jesus offered another way of interacting with the man in his blindness. Perhaps the man was part of God's glory. Perhaps his blindness was an invitation for fellowship rather than a cause for condemnation. Perhaps this was an invitation for a disciplined interaction as opposed to a casual glance and a snap judgment. Without engaging in disciplined interaction with the man, the disciples had misjudged him, mischaracterized him, and mislabeled him. And when we misjudge, mischaracterize, and mislabel people, we are more prone to mistreat them. And it's easier for us to feel good about mistreating them too. You understand? We usually treat people how we see them. And if we don't see them as worthwhile, we will treat them as if they are worthless. This temptation is especially strong when we deal with people and circumstances that are unfamiliar or different from who we are or what we're accustomed to encountering. And so when we see people who are immigrants or who are homosexuals or who are racial or ethnic minority group members who practice different religions, it's tempting to mislabel. It's tempting to mischaracterize. It's tempting to misjudge, and then tempting to mistreat. Not because God has ordained it, but because we are dealing with the casual contact rather than a disciplined interaction that God would have us go through. Thirdly, remember that God is radically unconventional. Remember that God is radically unconventional. Now, I know that is modifying a word that is itself controversial. Unconventional says it's different. Radical says it's out of the ordinary. So I know that's sort of putting a superlative on top of a superlative, but that's how God is. God is more than what we think. Who would have expected God to choose the runt of Jesse's family to be the ruler over Israel? Who would have expected a blind man to become a moral guide for the disciples of Jesus and for the other folks who were the religious big shots of his time? We often expect God to act according to our expectations and our habits and our traditions and our beliefs. And although we say God works in mysterious ways, we prefer to say that God's ways work according to the way we think. And so when we think a certain way, we say God's going to bless us because we thought it. Not true. Not true. God is radically unconventional. God uses a blind man to teach people about discernment. God uses a runt to teach a prophet what God wants in a ruler. God reserves the divine right to even use what we consider offensive for glorious purposes. Who would have thought that spitting on the ground, making mud out of the spit, making salve out of the mud, putting the salve on the man's eyes would be a diagnosis for the man's blindness? Most of us would say, don't want that. Don't want that. Don't want that. Notice what God does. God says, I'm not interested in your notion of conventionality. I'm not interested in your notion of what's natural or what's normal. I roll this way all the time. I'm always unconventional. In the beginning was nothing, and I made everything. Discernment requires that we realize that God always operates outside our boxes. God always draws outside the lines. Remember when we learned writing? We were told to stay within the lines. You know, remember that? Stay on the lines. God is always writing off the lines and off the page. And taking us to places that are not in our books. And coming up and saying, listen, this is who I want you to be, and I want you to stretch and grow. God doesn't stay inside the lines. God's always calling us to life that is higher and deeper and wider than we have ever known. So what God is showing us through Samuel and Jesse is that we have to live with discernment. Samuel learned that God sees a future ruler in someone that everyone else views as a runt. And through Jesus, the disciples learned that a blind beggar isn't a blind beggar. That's simply someone that God has been waiting on folks who think they can see so that he can be the instrument of teaching and moral insight. Now, the good news for you and me is that God sees our potential, even when those around us can't or won't. Even when others ignore us or misjudge us or mistreat us or mistrust us, God knows what we are worth and God loves us. And the good news also is that God will act with radical unconventionality to claim us and to call us and to commission us to fulfill glorious purposes. Others may be blind to our work, but God isn't. Others may reject us, but God won't. Others may condemn us because we're different, but God doesn't. And God won't allow their blindness to define what God has ordained we are to become. God does not allow the blindness of others to define our usefulness And so if other people don't see how useful you are, don't get your head hung down. God has some mud waiting. God has some spit waiting to wash some stuff away. And God has you waiting until God can get you ready to use you and use you for God's purposes in ways that are off the page. Oh, God will find you. God will send those folks who think they can see to you and use you to show them how blind they are. God will commission you. God will claim you. And then God will send you out as God's agent of spit. To make folks who think they see, see. And to challenge and to heal the blindness that prevents others from seeing the rulers and the teachers and the people they call runts and rejects. Thanks be to God.